Madeline Wells never thought moving into a quiet neighborhood would be the beginning of something so complex, calculated, and confrontational. She wasn't new to stress or to difficult personalities. Her career as a behavioral consultant for high-conflict environments had sharpened her sense of how people manipulate, corner, and provoke, but she certainly hadn't expected to apply that skill set to her own driveway. When she purchased the modest yet well-situated home on Ashbrook Lane, she saw it as a reset. A clean, peaceful property tucked away from city noise, with a broad, dual-lane driveway, a clean patch of front yard, and a garage she intended to convert into a private studio for remote work sessions. She liked that it was part of an established community, but not too tight-knit. People waved, but didn't pry. The kind of suburban anonymity that offered safety without surveillance. Madeline had no illusions about domestic bliss. She wasn't looking for new friends or barbecues or welcome committees, just predictability, privacy, and some control over her own space. And for the first few months, that's exactly what she had. Her mornings were quiet, the evenings uneventful. A few delivery hiccups, the occasional overly curious dog roaming too far into her flower beds, but nothing out of the ordinary. She met a few of her neighbors in passing. A retired couple on the left who nodded more than they spoke, a family of 5 across the street who rarely looked up from their minivan routine. And, of course, Karen Waits, the woman from the right hand. Lot, who made it her mission to be unavoidable. Karen introduced herself the same week Madeline moved in. She had that unsettling brand of hospitality that was 1 part neighborly, 2 parts territorial. She brought a welcome basket, unasked, uninvited, containing artisanal crackers, a small wheel of cheese, and a folded map of the neighborhood with 3 areas circled in red ink. Just little things to watch out for, she'd said with a chirp in her voice that barely covered the quiet severity in her eyes. Madeline accepted the gesture, thanked her politely, and made a mental note to keep interactions cordial and limited. There was something about Karen's smile that suggested she didn't just want to be kind. She wanted dominance masquerading as generosity. At first, it was the small things. Karen's constant monitoring of trash day, with unsolicited reminders about when the bins should be out, and then, if Madeline happened to bring hers in too late, a soft comment like, "Just didn't want you getting fined, dear." Then came the yard, suggestions. "I noticed your hose has a bit of slack that touches the sidewalk. Someone might trip. Just a heads up." Harmless on the surface, but always tinged with authority she hadn't earned. Madeline tolerated it, as most professionals who've dealt with power dynamics in institutional settings learn to do. Ignore it, contain it. Don't escalate unless absolutely necessary. Then, a month ago, Karen began hinting at renovations. "We're doing some work next door, small exterior things. I'm sure you won't even notice." Madeline nodded. She wasn't entitled to details, and she didn't care enough to ask. If Karen wanted to repaint her shutters or resurface her walkway, it wasn't her business. She was under no obligation to get involved. But Karen's use of the word "we" was odd. As far as Madeline had seen, Karen lived alone, unless you counted the procession of unfamiliar cars that came and went during the afternoons. Contractors, maybe, or distant family. It didn't matter. What mattered came 3 weeks later, early one Thursday morning, when Madeline opened her garage door and found her entire driveway blocked by a massive, industrial-sized trash container. It was the kind used for demolition debris. Thick steel, rust-spotted, squat like a grounded beast, and parked so close to her garage that she couldn't even edge her car out with precision driving. It wasn't just the container. Parked directly in front of it, blocking the street exit, was Karen's Tesla. White, gleaming, angled as though parked deliberately to prevent movement. For a moment, Madeline stood still, her morning coffee still in hand, absorbing the image. This wasn't a mistake. It was a setup. No cones, no note, no apology, nothing. Just an enormous piece of metal parked on her property and a luxury car guarding it like a sentry. She called Karen first, giving her the benefit of the doubt. No answer. She texted, "There's a large container in front of my garage. Please move your car so I can exit." No reply. 15 minutes passed. She knocked on Karen's door. Nothing. Finally, someone else opened the door. Someone unfamiliar. A woman in her 30s, pale, wearing an oversized hoodie and slippers. "Karen's not here," she said, rubbing her eyes. "She went out early." Madeline, puzzled, asked, "Do you know whose container that is?" The woman shrugged. "Karen said you were cool with it, that you'd agreed to let it sit there for the weekend." Madeline's expression didn't change, but her heart rate spiked. She hadn't agreed to anything. She would never allow that. And she definitely hadn't given permission for someone else to park a construction dumpster a few inches from her garage. She thanked the woman, walked back to her house, and pulled up the street footage from her side yard camera. It didn't show everything, but she caught enough. The container had been delivered after midnight, escorted by a private hauling company. Karen stood in a bathrobe, pointing toward the driveway. The driver asked something. Karen nodded and motioned him forward. The timestamp read 2:13 a.m. That same day, she called the management office, assuming there'd be some process, some rule about blocking another resident's access or using their driveway without permission. But their response was slow and non-committal. "These matters are typically resolved between neighbors," the rep said. "Unless there's an ongoing dispute or a safety concern, we don't get involved." Madeline asked them to document the call anyway and requested the property diagram be sent to her email. If there was going to be any kind of escalation, she needed proof on hand. She spent the next 3 hours calling the hauling company, the city sanitation hotline, and her lawyer. The hauling company claimed they couldn't remove the container without approval from the original requester. The city wouldn't intervene. It wasn't on public land. Her lawyer advised her to issue a formal notice via email and paper post, and to document everything, especially if Karen refused to move it. And so Madeline did exactly that. She wrote a clear, professional letter requesting removal within 24 hours, citing trespass and obstruction, and attached photo evidence. But deep down, she already knew this wasn't going to be resolved easily. She knew from the way Karen moved, from the confidence with which she had directed the delivery man, that this was not an accident and not a misunderstanding. It was a maneuver, an opening move in what was shaping up to be something calculated and territorial. Madeline wasn't just dealing with an entitled neighbor. She was dealing with someone who thought she could outplay the system by pretending the system didn't apply to her. And Madeline knew from experience, those are the most dangerous opponents of all. The container remained in a place for 2 days. On the first day, Madeline kept things measured. She parked her car along the curb 2 blocks away, walked the extra distance in heels without complaint, and stayed focused on her work. Her job required clarity of thought and a firm grasp on emotional regulation. She counseled educators, law enforcement, and family court representatives on how to de-escalate difficult personalities. Losing her composure because of a driveway obstruction would have felt hypocritical. But it was on the second day, when she received an email from the Neighborhood Oversight Office with the subject line, "Community Violation Notice," that her patience began to fray. The email was brief and deeply ironic. It claimed that several neighbors had expressed concern about a large, unsightly waste container positioned across from her garage. According to the automated notice, it was creating a hazard by obstructing visibility and affecting the aesthetic value of the neighborhood. Madeline read it twice. Then she read it a third time. Not because she hadn't understood it, but because her brain refused to accept the absurdity. She was being accused of the very offense someone else had inflicted on her property. The final line of the email offered a polite warning that if the obstruction was not cleared within 48 hours, she could face a fine or formal citation. No mention was made of the fact that the container wasn't hers. No indication that they had contacted Karen. It was a generic form letter, blind to circumstance, entirely reactive. Madeline responded immediately, attaching the same set of photographs she had compiled for her lawyer. She annotated the images, included timestamps, and added a copy of her formal request for removal that had been ignored. She also pointed out, without venom but with unmistakable clarity, that the container had been placed without her consent, and that Karen's vehicle was still blocking any access to the garage or driveway. Her tone was controlled, measured, but unmistakably firm. If she was going to be dragged into a public process, she intended to lead it by example. That same afternoon, she returned home from a short meeting to find 3 neighborhood maintenance workers standing near the container, clipboards in hand, taking notes. One of them noticed her approach and nodded. She didn't speak to them. She wasn't interested in triggering a scene, but she did catch one of them glancing toward Karen's yard and pointing in her direction, as if confirming something already understood. When she checked her mailbox later that day, she found a printed version of the same email notice, signed this time with a scribbled note. "If this is a mistake, please contact Karen directly. We only act on reported concerns." It was that line that finally shifted something in her. Not because it was malicious, but because it reflected exactly the kind of systemic laziness that people like Karen thrived on. Apathy disguised as neutrality. Policy used to avoid responsibility. A woman had illegally occupied her space, disrupted her ability to use her own property, lied about having permission, and somehow managed to frame the victim as the violator. And the mechanism in place to maintain fairness had shrugged and told her to figure it out on her own. Madeline didn't get angry, not in the traditional sense. She didn't yell or curse or fantasize about revenge. What she did was far more dangerous. She refocused. She made a list. She began to prepare for escalation. The next morning, she filed an incident report through the local municipality portal, flagging the situation not as a neighbor dispute, but as a potential zoning violation and unauthorized waste storage. She used technical language, referenced municipal codes, and requested a site review by a city assessor. She wasn't hoping for them to suddenly arrive with sirens and tow trucks, but she knew that paper trails mattered. That bureaucracy, slow and indifferent as it often was, still responded to formal pressure when correctly applied. Her lawyer, meanwhile, advised her to remain detached. "Do not engage directly," he said over the phone. "This isn't about convincing your neighbor to behave. It's about establishing a record. If she pushes this further, we'll have what we need." Madeline agreed, but staying silent didn't mean staying idle. That evening, she received a text from an unknown number. It read, "Just checking in. Are we all good with the container? Karen said you'd worked it out." There was no name, only a screenshot of a text exchange between Karen and the unknown party. Karen had apparently written, "She's totally fine with it. Said she's out all week anyway. Just keep it tight to the wall." Madeline stared at the image in disbelief. The lies were becoming bolder. She didn't even know who this person was. Likely one of the contractors involved. But Karen had no problem faking a conversation or fabricating approval. This wasn't just entitlement. It was strategy. That night, Madeline opened the community forum website and began reading threads. She hadn't paid much attention before. Most posts were about garage sales or lost pets. But now she looked for patterns. She found 2 older discussions where different neighbors had complained about being misunderstood by Karen, or accused of things they hadn't done. One thread described how Karen had reported a teenager for riding a skateboard too close to her property, claiming he was damaging the curb, only for the boy's parents to share security footage that disproved it. Another post hinted that Karen had tried to shift responsibility for a broken fence to the family next door, despite clear evidence that her own landscaping crew had backed into it with a trailer. The posts weren't aggressive, just tired. No one had taken action. Most had just let it go. That, Madeline realized, was part of the problem. People were trained to avoid conflict, to smooth over friction, to pretend neighborly disputes were misunderstandings instead of power plays. Karen relied on that avoidance. She knew how to operate within that gap between apathy and procedure, but Madeline wasn't wired that way. And now, Karen had made a crucial mistake. She had taken something tangible. Not respect, not dignity. Real estate, physical space, and once someone starts drawing imaginary lines on real ground, the argument stops being social and becomes legal. On the third morning, Madeline made her decision. She contacted a local towing company that specialized in property obstruction cases. They weren't cheap and they weren't fast, but they were thorough. She explained the situation, provided documentation, and confirmed that the car and container were both blocking her legal access. She expected resistance, but the manager on the phone sounded almost bored. "Oh, these kinds of calls? We get 'em all the time," he said. "You've got the documents. Then it's your right. Just confirm with law enforcement before we move the car, and we'll bring a double-lift unit." By noon, she had submitted the official request. By 3 p.m., the tow truck had arrived. And by 3:30, the container, with Karen's Tesla still parked inches from its steel edge, was being hoisted onto a flatbed. Madeline stood on her front step, arms folded, watching in silence. The operator gave her a quick thumbs up before securing the vehicle and climbing into the cab. The Tesla wasn't damaged, yet, but it was going for a ride, and Madeline didn't feel satisfaction. Not yet. That part, she knew, would come later, if it came at all. Right now, all she felt was resolve. The game had changed. Karen had opened a door she couldn't close, and from now on, every step would be documented, every decision calculated. This was no longer a neighborly disagreement. This was a boundary war, and Madeline had no intention of losing ground. Madeline didn't expect silence, but the speed and ferocity of the backlash still caught her off guard. It began early the next morning, less than 12 hours after the container and Karen's Tesla had been removed. She stepped out to retrieve the mail and found a handwritten note shoved into the crack of her front door, carefully folded but stained by early dew. The paper was thick, almost formal, but the handwriting was a different story. Tight, angry, tilted letters pressed too hard into the page. "You crossed a line," it began, unsigned but unmistakable in its tone. "Actions have consequences. You've embarrassed someone who was only trying to be generous. Good luck getting along with the rest of us." The phrase, "the rest of us," chilled her more than the threat itself. It implied community, consensus, a vague collective that Karen had now recruited. Whether or not that collective truly existed didn't matter. The idea of being outnumbered in her own neighborhood, framed as an aggressor for defending her legal property, created a deep, physical unease in her chest. She scanned the street instinctively, noting a car idling too long at the stop sign, a woman across the road who suddenly looked down at her phone. Paranoia, possibly, but not without reason. Not anymore. By midday, the situation escalated in a more measurable way. A call came from the property manager, this time not automated. The woman identified herself as Diane, someone Madeline hadn't spoken with before. Her tone was clipped and officious. "We've received multiple inquiries regarding yesterday's tow event," she began, as though reading from a script. "There are concerns about procedural violations and potential liability for damage to private property." Madeline stayed calm, took notes, and waited for the end of the script. When Diane finally stopped speaking, she replied in her own careful cadence, "I documented the situation extensively, confirmed legal ownership of the obstructed space, filed notice, and coordinated with law enforcement before arranging removal. If you have a question about the legality, I'm happy to forward my lawyer's contact information. Otherwise, I suggest we focus on who placed the obstruction in the first place." There was a pause. Diane's voice, when it returned, had cooled noticeably. "This neighborhood thrives on cooperation, Ms. Wells. I would encourage you to think about how your actions are being perceived." That was the moment it became clear. This wasn't just a fight between Madeline and Karen. It had metastasized into something broader, something quietly political. Karen had begun weaving a narrative, likely long before the towing incident. The story, if Madeline guessed correctly, was that she was uncooperative, rigid, maybe even unstable. A woman unwilling to blend in, who escalated instead of compromising. And in a neighborhood where appearances mattered more than facts, perception often won. The following week unfolded like a slow-burn siege. Madeline's trash can was knocked over twice. Once in the early morning, once at night, the contents spread methodically across the driveway. Her mail began arriving damp, as though someone had poured water over the envelopes before delivery. Someone left a single garden gnome near her mailbox, just one, painted in garish colors and positioned at a subtle angle so its gaze seemed fixed on her front window. Petty acts, ridiculous even, but they chipped away at the veneer of normalcy. On Thursday, as she returned home after a long session with a client, Madeline found a second notice taped to her door, this time from the city. It cited a complaint filed anonymously, accusing her of conducting unauthorized commercial activity on residential property. She blinked in disbelief, then read it again. The language suggested she was running a business illegally out of her home. She was not. Yes, she occasionally held private consultations over video from her converted garage, but it was zoned for remote work and she had never advertised locally. The complaint was baseless, but it still triggered an inquiry. She called her lawyer again, who sighed in the way only attorneys do when they've seen this pattern before. "Classic nuisance strategy," he said. "Bog you down in minor claims, keep you in reaction mode. We'll respond formally. Don't try to play defense, just keep documenting." But Madeline couldn't help feeling hemmed in. The harassment wasn't aggressive enough to bring police action, not overt enough to prove malicious intent, but persistent enough to wear her down. Every day was another micro-intrusion. Her side gate found slightly ajar when she knew she had latched it. Unfamiliar footprints tracked across the wet soil in her side yard, a piece of broken glass that hadn't been there the day before. She began to check her perimeter reflexively, not out of fear, but strategy, collecting timestamps, images, small inconsistencies. Her experience with behavioral threats taught her that even paranoia can be methodical when channeled through logic. One night, she arrived home to find her motion sensor light disabled. The small black lens had been carefully smeared with a sticky, opaque film. Not shattered, not removed, just quietly neutralized. It was the most calculated act yet, one that required forethought, a trip up a ladder, and precise timing. She stood there for a long time in the dark, holding her keys. Not angry, not afraid, just alert. She didn't go inside right away. Instead, she walked the property slowly, her eyes adjusting, her mind ticking through possibilities. The next morning, she hired a private technician to install a new set of cameras. Not DIY security, a professional system with encrypted cloud backups and heat-sensitive detection zones. She made sure the tech understood the nuances of placement. "I don't need a show of strength," she told him. "I need evidence that holds up in court." He nodded. It wasn't his first job like this. Later that afternoon, a neighbor approached her for the first time since the incident. A man in his 60s, well-groomed, polite, but visibly hesitant. "I just wanted to say, I saw the truck last week," he murmured, hands in his pockets. "That wasn't right, what they did to your driveway. I've had issues too, but I'm not really looking to get involved." He nodded once and walked away. It was nothing. And it was everything. Someone had seen. Someone else had noticed. But the culture of silence around Karen's behavior was deeply entrenched. People wanted peace more than justice. They would rather avoid conflict than confront someone who wielded soft power so ruthlessly. The final blow came at the end of the week. Madeline returned from a grocery run to find a package addressed to her but never ordered. Inside was a single gardening glove, pink, child-sized, filthy, and a note. "Found this near your property. Thought you'd want it back." No sender, no name, no return address. She didn't recognize the glove. She didn't touch it. She just photographed it, bagged it, and placed it into the growing folder labeled Incidents. She didn't call Karen. She didn't knock on her door. She didn't raise her voice or send an email or make a dramatic scene. What she did was simpler, colder, and more effective. She forwarded the photo and the note to her attorney and to the local precinct liaison. Then she scheduled a consultation with a property rights specialist and began preparing for the next move. Because by now it was clear. Karen wasn't done, and neither was she. By the end of the second week, Madeline had grown so accustomed to subtle violations and veiled hostility that when the actual breaking point arrived, it felt almost clinical, like an expected shift in patient behavior after a prolonged period of controlled observation. There was no singular explosion, no midnight confrontation on the front lawn. Instead, the pivot came in the form of precision, evidence, timing, and the slow unraveling of Karen's fabricated narrative. What Karen hadn't calculated, despite all her games, was that Madeline's restraint wasn't a weakness. It was a measured strategy, the kind designed not to survive conflict but to outmaneuver it entirely. It began with the arrival of a letter. Not a complaint, not a threat, but a formal notice from the city's zoning and planning department. Unlike the previous ambiguous citation about unauthorized commercial use, this letter was detailed, composed, and official in every sense. It stated that a citizen had filed a request to review the property boundaries and permits for 3 homes on Ashbrook Lane, specifically Madeline's, Karen's, and the neighbor to the east. The reasoning: possible encroachment of non-permitted structural features and access violations. The word encroachment was underlined in red ink, likely by Karen's own hand before she scanned and submitted her petition. Madeline didn't panic. Instead, she took the letter directly to her attorney and asked him one simple question. "Can we turn this into a weapon?" The attorney, a real estate litigation specialist named Colin, who had spent over 2 decades navigating property feuds, smiled, without humor. "Yes, but only if you're willing to go on record and let the city do their job." Madeline didn't hesitate. Let them dig. Within 3 days, a city assessor arrived with a clipboard, a digital level, and a small drone used to capture overhead images. Madeline welcomed him with a printed packet of documents: her original purchase paperwork, the detailed boundary survey from the time of sale, and photos showing her garage, driveway, and side yard exactly as they'd been when the house was purchased. She watched as he took measurements, operated the drone, and nodded along with her commentary. He wasn't there to take sides, but he was impressed by her preparation. When he left, Madeline exhaled not with relief, but with calculation. She knew Karen would see the drone, would hear of the visit, and would assume she had scored a win. Let her feel victorious long enough to relax her guard. 2 days later, the assessor returned to Karen's property. Madeline didn't watch directly, but she noted the subtle change in pace, how long the visit lasted, how often the assessor stopped to speak with Karen's crew, how animated her body language became. At one point, Madeline heard her voice through the hedges, sharp, defensive, raising questions with increasing pitch. It was the first time Karen's tone cracked in a way that suggested she wasn't confident. She was cornered. That evening, the shift became official. Colin called with news. The assessor flagged her for structural non-compliance. That retaining wall along her eastern fence? It was rebuilt 2 years ago without permits. And based on drone footage, it crosses into the setback buffer by at least a meter. That's a zoning issue. A fine, possibly an order to tear it down. He paused. And her complaint about your access? Rejected. Boundary lines are clean. Her car and container were both entirely on your property. Madeline closed her eyes, not in triumph, but in focus. So, what's next? We respond, formally. We cite this pattern of harassment, the fabricated approvals, the unauthorized use of your land, and we attach the assessor's report. Then, we send copies to the management office and request a formal complaint hearing on your terms. For the first time in weeks, Madeline allowed herself a breath that didn't feel borrowed. It wasn't a full victory, but it was the moment the tide began to shift, the moment she transitioned from defense to offense. But Karen, as expected, didn't retreat quietly. The following morning, 2 official-looking men arrived at Madeline's home, identifying themselves as representatives from a pest control company responding to a complaint. They claimed someone had reported rat activity along her property line. Madeline asked to see the report. They said they couldn't show it. It was private, but they were required to assess the area. She declined entry. She knew the game. Call uninvited services, flood her with costs, raise suspicion through paper. It was another tactic from Karen's toolbox. Create a cloud of impropriety, then let bureaucracy do the smearing. Madeline reported the incident to Colin, who added it to the complaint file. Later that afternoon, another neighbor sent her an anonymous message through the neighborhood app. Just so you know, Karen's telling people you're hoarding chemicals in your garage for experiments. She says the city is watching you. Be careful. The absurdity of it would have been laughable if it weren't so methodical. Karen wasn't trying to prove anything. She was trying to fabricate enough noise that anything might stick. But what Karen didn't realize was that the walls were already closing in. Madeline's lawyer had submitted a full motion requesting a review hearing not only for the driveway dispute, but for Karen's entire pattern of behavior. Attached were time-stamped photos, the drone footage, written statements from service technicians, and the city's own documentation confirming Karen's code violations. It wasn't just a neighbor complaint anymore. It was an escalating liability review, and perhaps most critically, Colin had reached out to the municipal insurance office, raising concerns about Karen's recent use of unlicensed contractors. If her retaining wall collapsed, or if her verbal accusations led to harm or retaliation, the city could be held accountable for not acting on repeated red flags. That, more than anything, sparked action. Within 48 hours, Karen received a letter of her own, this time from the city attorney's office. The content was simple but devastating: a notice of non-compliance, a request for a permit audit, and a deadline to correct structural violations or face legal enforcement. According to Colin, the letter had legal weight. If Karen failed to respond properly, she could face daily fines and possibly a lien on her property. Madeline didn't gloat. She didn't need to. What mattered was that the playing field was no longer theoretical. It was legal. And now, every action had consequences. Real, measurable ones. That night, she sat on her porch with the lights off, a cup of tea in her hand, and for the first time in weeks, the street felt quiet again. Not just in sound, but in pressure. She knew it wasn't over. But the balance had shifted. Karen had opened the game with a move she assumed would go unchecked, but now the board had changed. And Madeline had proven she wasn't a piece to be pushed around. She was a player. By the time the official violation letter reached Karen's mailbox, the dynamic between her and Madeline had fundamentally shifted. What had started as a passive-aggressive flex of local dominance had become a war of sustained attrition. Only now, one side was bleeding credibility. Yet Karen, true to form, refused to concede. Her tactics, once veiled in the language of helpfulness and neighborhood concern, evolved into overt manipulation. No more notes on floral stationery, no more half-smiles across the hedgerow. Now it was legal posturing, indirect intimidation, and the slow deployment of every institutional avenue available to someone who refused to be publicly wrong. 2 days after the city issued the non-compliance notice, Madeline came home to find 2 orange flags planted in her lawn. At first, she thought they were utility markers, but upon closer inspection they bore the name of a land surveying company she'd never contacted. The flags traced a diagonal line through her front yard, skirting the edge of her garden, and pointed directly at the boundary she shared with Karen. No notice, no explanation, just the flags, sharp and bright like a challenge. She contacted Colin immediately, who made a few calls and confirmed that Karen had hired a private surveyor. "She's trying to dispute the city's findings," he explained, "probably looking to claim that the drone footage was misinterpreted. It's desperation, but she's within her rights to order an independent survey. Just don't engage." Madeline didn't. She kept her distance and instead turned her attention to the growing complexity of Karen's campaign. That same evening, she received an email from the Neighborhood Council's advisory group, an entity that had been silent throughout the conflict, informing her that a review had been requested regarding her recent, aggressive actions. The phrasing was deliberately vague, but the implication was clear. Karen had submitted a complaint alleging that Madeline's legal defenses were themselves a form of hostility. The idea was absurd. But again, that wasn't the point. Karen wasn't interested in winning in court. She was interested in flooding every available channel with counterclaims, triggering investigations, slowing response times, and forcing Madeline to live in a perpetual state of defense. It was a psychological war disguised as civic participation, and it was effective. Over the next week, small escalations piled up like kindling. Someone left a dead plant on Madeline's front step, its roots dry, its pot shattered as if it had been dropped deliberately. Her trash bin was dragged out into the street overnight and left lying on its side, its contents torn open. Packages began arriving with her name, but no sender, most of them empty or filled with nonsense. Old socks, expired coupons, crumpled receipts. One even contained a laminated photo of her own house, taken from the sidewalk, with no note enclosed. The police were sympathetic, but constrained. None of it crossed the threshold into provable criminal behavior. The photos weren't threatening. The mail wasn't stolen. The plant, as they put it, could have been a mistake. "Just keep a log," the officer said, not unkindly. "But unless someone breaks a law, there's not much we can do." Madeline nodded. She understood. She'd counseled people in similar situations, stalked not by a person, but by behavior, ambiguity, the calculated use of plausible deniability. Still, she refused to retreat. If Karen wanted to turn the neighborhood into a battleground of nerves, Madeline would meet her at every level. She installed a secondary camera system, one that didn't rely on visible mounts or solar power. Battery-operated, cloud-synced, and hidden inside ordinary fixtures, a fake birdhouse, a decorative stone, even a hollow porch light cover. If Karen, or one of her proxies, stepped foot on Madeline's property again, it would be recorded from multiple angles. The surveillance paid off within 3 days. A man in work overalls, not one of the usual contractors, appeared on her side yard at dusk, walking the line where the flags had been placed. He took photos, measured something with a tape reel, and made a call. His words were barely audible, but one phrase caught the microphone clearly. "She doesn't know I'm here." He left 10 minutes later, but not before spraying a faint chalk line across the base of her fence. Madeline submitted the footage to the city's enforcement division, flagging it as unauthorized trespassing. Her lawyer pushed to add it to the ongoing complaint. The city, now officially engaged, sent a follow-up inspection order to Karen's property and opened a secondary file under civic misconduct. The fallout came faster than expected. The independent survey Karen had commissioned was invalidated after it was revealed the contractor didn't possess an updated state license. Karen was fined for submitting fraudulent documents to the council. The violation wasn't enormous, 1/200, but the symbolic damage was critical. Her credibility, once cloaked in PTA polish and local alliances, now had visible cracks. But instead of retreating, Karen pivoted again. She held a private gathering at her house that weekend, A barbecue, ostensibly, but with no food in sight. Just groups of people clustered on lawn chairs, low voices, sideways glances toward Madeline's property. One woman pointed at the cameras. Another took a photo of Madeline's car. Karen, ever theatrical, made sure to wave from her driveway, glass of wine in hand, the picture of suburban confidence. It was performative dominance. The message, I still control the narrative. Madeline didn't respond. Instead, she filed a civil pre-litigation notice, officially stating her intent to pursue damages if the harassment continued. She wasn't bluffing. The documentation was overwhelming. False reports, illegal placement of property, defamation, targeted vandalism, abuse of process. Her lawyer drafted the language carefully, citing case precedents and aligning each incident with statutory violations. The letter was delivered via courier. Signed receipt required. Karen responded within hours, not with a formal reply, but with theatrics. She parked her Tesla directly in front of Madeline's mailbox, partially blocking the curb cut, then left it there overnight. No movement, no explanation, no attempt to disguise it. It was a final act of petty defiance, both laughable and telling. The next morning, the city issued her a parking citation. Then another notice followed. A lien had been placed on her property until the outstanding fines related to the retaining wall and survey fraud were resolved. According to Colin, it was the beginning of a cascade. Once liens appear, he explained, she'll either have to pay, sell, or be dragged into court to force compliance. And she's made a lot of enemies. Don't be surprised if others start stepping forward. That evening, Madeline received an envelope in her mailbox. No address, no return. Inside was a single index card with one sentence, written in block capitals. You should have kept quiet. She held it for a moment, let the weight of its threat settle, then slipped it into the evidence binder, date-stamped and photographed. She didn't feel fear. Not anymore, just clarity. Karen had thrown every tool she had, social pressure, false civility, bureaucratic manipulation, and community smear tactics, and still the law was catching up to her. The system hadn't protected Madeline, not initially, but it had started to listen once she pushed hard enough, long enough, with enough precision and restraint. The fight wasn't over, but the tide had turned unmistakably. And now, every new act from Karen only added to a file that would eventually be read aloud before a judge. The culmination came not with sirens or a dramatic confrontation, but with paperwork, timing, and a single miscalculation. It had been nearly 6 weeks since Karen had blocked Madeline's driveway with that container. 6 weeks of veiled threats, legal maneuvering, community whisper campaigns, and daily psychological warfare. But, like most power structures built on illusion, Karen's crumbled the moment it collided with real, traceable consequences. What undid her was neither Madeline's vigilance nor her silence. It was Karen's inability to believe that someone could outlast her. She had expected resistance, yes. She had even anticipated escalation. But she had assumed, like always, that at some point her opponent would break. Lash out, misstep, or simply withdraw from the exhaustion. She hadn't accounted for someone who would keep moving forward, slowly, quietly, relentlessly, and with documentation stacked in neat chronological order. The trigger arrived on a Monday morning via courier envelope. Madeline received it at her door. Signature required, time-stamped. Inside was a notice from the City Code Enforcement Division. A scheduled administrative hearing regarding the multiple complaints against Karen Waits, including zoning violations, false reporting, and obstruction of property. Madeline wasn't just listed as a witness. She was the filing party. Her case had been reviewed, deemed credible, and was now entering the final phase before court action. Colin, her attorney, called 30 minutes later with a calm confirmation. She has 10 business days to respond, he said. If she doesn't, the hearing becomes binding. If she does, we present everything. Either way, it's done. Karen didn't wait 10 days. Within 48 hours, she launched her counterstrike, one last attempt to flip the board. That Wednesday, Madeline woke to find her side gate hanging open, not broken, but unlatched. Inside the yard, someone had placed a small cardboard box at the edge of her garage door, weighted down with a rock. Inside, a printed stack of papers, each one a copy of a fabricated agreement, allegedly signed by Madeline weeks prior, stating she had approved the placement of the trash container as a temporary storage arrangement. The signature wasn't hers, but it mimicked the cursive from one of her earlier digital applications, lifted and repurposed. It was a crude forgery, not professional but dangerous enough to create confusion. Madeline didn't touch the documents. She photographed everything, then called the local precinct to report the materials. Within an hour, officers arrived, reviewed the scene, and submitted the box as potential evidence of attempted fraud. When asked if she suspected who placed the materials, Madeline answered without hesitation. Karen waits. This isn't her first attempt to falsify approval. The officer, young but sharp, raised an eyebrow. Do you have proof? Madeline opened the binder she kept ready near the door, laid out the timeline, and pointed to the discrepancies. The officer didn't smile, but he took notes, and, more importantly, he took it seriously. 2 days later, city inspectors arrived unannounced at Karen's property, not for zoning, not for noise or sanitation, but for the growing suspicion of document tampering. The inspectors weren't alone. An officer from the precinct accompanied them. From her porch, Madeline watched as the conversation played out. Karen gesturing wildly, her face taut with disbelief, her hands moving with a kind of frantic grace that only someone used to being listened to can summon when they realize they're not in control. Eventually, they left with a folder. Karen didn't wave this time, but the most telling sign of collapse came the next evening. Madeline was returning home from a late appointment when she noticed that Karen's lights were all on. All of them. Upstairs, downstairs, even the garage floodlight, though it was only dusk. It wasn't a welcoming glow, it was defensive. Defensive and exposed. Karen had built her power through manipulation in the shadows. Conversations at mailbox corners, emails laced with vague concern, a soft tyranny enforced by the fear of social reprisal. Now that light flooded every inch of her property, she looked cornered. Not dangerous, just small. The hearing proceeded the following week. Karen appeared with a different lawyer than before, this one stiff, awkward, unfamiliar with local statutes. Madeline didn't speak unless prompted. Colin handled the presentation, a clean, chronological display of harassment, falsification, trespass, and abuse of administrative systems. The photos, the footage, the inspector testimonies, all of it laid out methodically, free of embellishment. Just facts. The adjudicator, a stern woman with decades of zoning law experience, asked only a few questions. When Karen's lawyer attempted to introduce the forged agreement, the document was immediately dismissed due to lack of authentication. This is not signed in any legally binding format, the adjudicator said flatly, turning the page, and the original document provided by Ms. Wells contradicts it directly. Karen's voice, when she finally spoke, was high, tense. This woman has been antagonizing me from the day she moved in. She came here with an agenda, and she's trying to turn the neighborhood against me. Colin didn't flinch. My client moved into a house she purchased legally. She lived quietly until her access was blocked without consent, and the obstruction was followed by a sustained campaign of misinformation and harassment. What she did was defend herself. What Ms. Waits did was try to erase her right to do so. There was no immediate verdict that day, but everyone in the room felt it. The weight of the shift, the end of Karen's narrative, the exposure of a pattern that could no longer be explained away as misunderstanding or poor communication. As they left the room, Karen walked straight past Madeline without looking at her. No glare, no smirk, no comment. Just absence. Later that evening, a notice was posted on the neighborhood forum by the management office. A reminder that the misuse of complaint processes could result in sanctions, including exclusion from advisory roles. It didn't name Karen. It didn't have to. The tone had changed. And in the quiet that followed, Madeline finally allowed herself a moment she'd refused for weeks. Not celebration, not victory, but stillness. She sat on her porch in the early dusk, the air cool against her skin, the sky streaked with orange and blue. There were no packages, no flags, no trash, just space, undisturbed. The culmination hadn't come with a bang, but with the slow disassembly of a fiction. And Madeline knew with certainty that fiction could never be rebuilt. In the weeks that followed the hearing, the neighborhood began to recalibrate, not in sweeping gestures or loud admissions, but in the quiet ways power realigns when the illusion of invincibility is pierced. Karen no longer parked in front of Madeline's house, nor did she hold her performative garden chats within earshot. She remained in her home, lights low, blinds drawn, but the tension that had once radiated from her presence now felt hollow, disconnected. She had not vanished, but she had retreated, and in her retreat, the street exhaled. Madeline noticed the changes slowly. One afternoon, a neighbor she'd only exchanged a handful of words with paused as he walked his dog, nodded, and said, "I saw the hearing summary. You handled it with class." A few days later, the retired couple next door, who had maintained strict neutrality for months, stopped by with a tray of lemon squares. "We never said anything," the woman admitted. "But we knew. Everyone knew. We just didn't want to be the next target." There was no shame in their voices, only fatigue, shared fatigue from years of walking a line too fine to define. But for Madeline, the resolution wasn't in those gestures. It was in the return of normalcy, mundane, grounded, unceremonious. The noise stopped. The false packages stopped. Her yard remained untouched, her mailbox undisturbed. The cameras stayed in place, not out of paranoia, but out of habit now, like locking a door out of muscle memory. Her relationship with her home, once strained under the weight of forced vigilance, began to reset. She worked from her garage again, uninterrupted. She mowed her lawn without scanning for planted objects. She spent evenings outside without wondering who might be watching. The hearing verdict arrived by certified mail 2 weeks after closing statements. The claims against Karen had been upheld. She was ordered to pay fines, dismantle the unpermitted retaining wall, and issue a public retraction of her fabricated agreement. The city council would review her eligibility for future participation in neighborhood leadership roles, pending further investigation. It was a dry, procedural letter, absent of emotion or sympathy. But for Madeline, it meant something deeper, confirmation not only of truth, but of resilience. She had not just endured. She had dismantled a sustained campaign of coercion using only facts, law, and patience. Yet even with the conflict officially closed, there was no celebratory climax. No victory barbecue, no toasts on front porches. The damage Karen had inflicted on the neighborhood's trust was too subtle and too long-standing to be repaired with one decision. But what Madeline had done was reset the precedent. She had proven that silence was not the only path, that defending one's space did not have to be loud or emotional to be effective. She had redrawn the boundary, not just of her driveway, but of what would be tolerated moving forward. On a warm Friday evening, Madeline took a walk through the neighborhood, something she hadn't done since the container appeared. The sun was low, the sidewalks empty. She passed Karen's house without stopping. The blinds were still drawn, the porch empty. There were no signs of confrontation, no remnants of the months-long siege. Just another house, quiet and unremarkable. As she turned the corner, a younger woman from down the block caught up to her, breathless from jogging. "I just want to say," she said between gasps, "that what you did, you gave the rest of us a map. We didn't know how to push back until you showed us how." Madeline thanked her, offered a polite nod, and continued walking. The words were appreciated, but she wasn't looking for admiration. What she had wanted all along was what she had now. Space that was hers, peace that wasn't conditional on silence, and the knowledge that boundaries, once defended properly, did not need to be defended again and again. Later that night, she sat at her desk and reviewed the final entries in her evidence log before closing the file. She didn't delete the footage or tear up the documents. She archived them, not out of fear, but out of principle. Some wars aren't fought to be remembered. They're fought so they never have to be fought again. And so the file was sealed, the cameras stayed, and the porch lights remained steady. Because Madeline knew, peace wasn't passive. It was maintained, protected, and when necessary, proven.